Visualize this scenario. At a demonstration in Budapest, the blue flag of NATO is thrown to the ground and mercilessly trampled. The Prime Minister of a NATO member state openly flies to Moscow, shakes hands with President Putin, then travels to Beijing, subsequently to Florida to meet with Donald Trump. All this while completely disregarding the Brussels leadership, which is howling in fury. In the 75-year history of the NATO bloc, an anomaly so bizarre and contrary has never been witnessed within the alliance. Typically, NATO's adversaries reside outside the wall. It's Russia, extremist groups, or strategic Eastern rivals. Yet today, the sharpest dagger is being pointed at NATO from its very core. Most recently, a shocking proposal was issued by Hungary, sending tremors through both Washington and Kyiv. Hungary is not merely calling for a ceasefire. They are demanding a brutal geopolitical shift, transforming Ukraine into a neutral buffer zone. In other words, stripping Ukraine of its aspiration to join the West in exchange for the security of Europe. Why does Hungary, a small nation nestled in the heart of Europe, dare to deliver such a brazen rebuke to the entire Western system? Is Viktor Orbán truly Putin's Trojan horse? Or is he the solitary voice of reason in a chamber full of sleepwalkers leading the world toward a third world war? Slapped to Brussels, from a forbidden handshake to the buffer zone proposal to grasp the severity of Hungary's actions. One must examine the chain of events that the West is now openly calling a serial betrayal. It all began in July 2024, when Budapest assumed the rotating presidency of the European Union. This should have been a period for Hungary to act as a neutral coordinator, but Viktor Orbán transformed it into an unprecedented stage for diplomatic insurrection, without notice or seeking approval from the European Commission. He flagrantly broke the rules of the game with the multi-hotspot tours, Kyiv, Moscow, and Beijing. The culmination was in Moscow, where Orbán confidently shook hands with Putin, acting as if he had no regard for the EU stance. In the eyes of Brussels, that handshake was not just a diplomatic gesture. It was a fiery slap to the entire machinery of isolating Russia that the EU had painstakingly constructed since 2022. In response, EU leaders erupted in anger, threatening to boycott meetings in Budapest, freeze funds, and impose sanctions. But Orbán merely shrugged. He understood that the EU could roar, but it could not strike. From the voting mechanism to internal solidarity, Brussels lacks the tools to force Orbán-esque capitulation. And he has fully exploited this systemic weakness to fracture the entire narrative of unity for Ukraine that the West has attempted to maintain. However, Orbán's greatest gambit was not in secret flights, but in a public declaration that profoundly shocked Europe. On November 29th, before millions, he articulated what virtually no other Western leader dared to admit: Ukraine cannot defeat Russia. This was not an emotional statement, but one based on the realities of the battlefield: weakened defensive lines, shortages of ammunition, troops, and defense industry capacity compounded by the strategic fatigue of the entire West. He did not stop there. Orbán proposed that Ukraine should not join NATO or the EU, but rather return to its status as a neutral buffer zone between Russia and the West. Underwritten by international security guarantees, but excluding NATO's Article 5 protection, this implicitly means openly acknowledging a sensitive truth that the entire Brussels-Washington axis has consistently evaded. Russia's initial security demands were, in fact, logically sound. For Kyiv, this represents a bitter humiliation. Yet, when examining the war map, the rapid deterioration of Ukrainian forces, and internal CIA and US military reports on the balance of power, Orbán-esque proposal is far from irrational. It may even be the sole viable exit for Ukraine to retain territory and national sovereignty, rather than being ground down in an endless war.
The dissent is not confined to the leadership level. The domestic situation within Hungary is equally fervent.
Numerous videos circulating online show thousands of Hungarian citizens taking to the streets to protest NATO, military aid, and the potential for Hungary to be used as a staging ground for the war. They display slogans demanding no weapons, no war, no migration, perfectly reflecting the core tenets of the government's policy. While Poland, Germany, and the Baltic states continuously transfer artillery, missiles, and tanks to Ukraine, Hungary stands as the sole NATO nation that not only refuses to provide aid, but also bans the transit of weapons through its territory. This small state's courage to say no amidst Europe's prevailing war frenzy represents an unprecedented challenge to Brussels. More critically, these actions by Budapest are not spontaneous outbursts. This is a cold, consistent strategy developed by Orbán over many years, remaining outside the Russia-West conflict, prioritizing the protection of national interests and ensuring Hungary does not pay a price in blood and economic stability for the war of others. While the West speeds downhill like a tank with severed brakes, Hungary is the singular nation standing in the road and pulling the handbrake. And despite being denounced as a traitor, a Trojan horse, or Putin's insider, Orbán remains firm as a rock, the illogicality of the war and the iron logic of Budapest. The West's suspicion regarding Hungary's loyalty to the bloc is not baseless. Given Budapest's persistent resistance to NATO initiatives and its continuous alignment with Russia on key issues from opposing the seizure of Russian assets and the arrest warrant for Putin to vetoing aid packages for Ukraine. However, one must be unequivocally clear. Hungary is not acting out of affection for Russia. They are acting because they are profoundly weary of the hypocrisy, the illogicality, and the self-destructive policies that the West is forcing upon the entire continent. First, the economic illogicality. Viktor Orbán is not a leader who governs by rhetoric. He's a pragmatist, cold as steel when analyzing figures. The EU sanctioned Russian energy hoping to cripple Moscow's economy. The result? Russia channeled oil sales to India and China at record volumes. Money continues to flow into the Russian treasury with Swiss watch regularity. Meanwhile, Europe is forced to buy US LNG at triple the cost. Germany's industrial base, the manufacturing heart of the EU, plunged into an energy crisis and protracted recession. Inflation in Hungary, at one point, hit 25%, the highest in Europe. Orbán once delivered a line that made Brussels leaders livid. We are shooting ourselves in the foot, and then we are shooting ourselves directly in the lungs. For him, maintaining energy ties with Russia the Rosatom led pacts to nuclear project. The functional Druzhba pipeline is not subservience, but a safeguard. It is ensuring Hungarian citizens have electricity and gas, rather than exchanging stability for empty applause. Second, the hopelessness of Ukraine. While NATO leaders continue to rally for Ukraine to fight until ultimate victory, Orbán looks directly at the conflict map with a clear, unillusioned eye. He sees the collapse of the Pokrov's defensive line. He sees Ukraine lowering the conscription age and sweeping the streets for young men to send to the Donbass front. He sees Western armories depleting, the US internally divided, and Europe economically exhausted. From Hungary's perspective, NATO's continued drip-feeding of funds and weapons to Ukraine is nothing more than prolonging the agony. Third, the risk of a world war. This danger is one that politicians in Brussels never truly internalize. Hungary stands directly on the Ukrainian border, closer than any NATO state except Poland and Romania. If NATO opens the door for Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike deep inside Russian territory, and if Russia retaliates with tactical nuclear weapons, who will bear the brunt of the shockwaves? The US is safe across the ocean. Hungary, however, is on the front line facing all consequences: radiation, fallout, mass migration, and the risk of being dragged into a war they never desired. Orbán is pulling the NATO emergency brake, not to help Russia win, but to prevent Russia from being cornered into pressing the nuclear button, which would turn Europe to ashes. In short, Hungary is not betraying NATO. They are merely refusing to follow a frantic crowd. The new Soviet bully. When the EU becomes a dictator, a deeper, more profound element explaining Hungary's defiance lies within the very structure of the European Union. Viktor Orbán, who fought against Soviet control as a young man in the 1980s, now sees the shadow of the former Soviet Union manifesting in Brussels: erosion of independence. Today's EU and NATO are no longer alliances of sovereign nations. They are transforming into a supranational state determined to impose a singular ideology on all members. This includes the woke ideology, support for mass migration, LGBTQ advocacy, and a mandatory anti-Russian posture. Hungary, a conservative nation prioritizing nationalism, traditional family values, and Christianity, has become a thorn in Brussels' side. Coercion by funds. The action that has most enraged the Hungarian populace. is the EU's freezing of over 20 billion euros in cohesion funds for Hungary, citing rule of law concerns. The reality, universally understood, is that this is punishment for Hungary's refusal to send weapons to Ukraine and open its borders to migrants. The EC president has openly used financial leverage to force a member state to change its domestic policy. To Orbán, this is not democracy. It is bullying. It is the behavior of a colonial power. This coercion has pushed Hungary closer to Russia and China. If the West will not respect Hungary's sovereignty, Hungary will seek partners who will. Finally, there is a detail consistently ignored by Western media. Approximately 150,000 ethnic Hungarians reside in Ukraine's Zakarpattia region. The government in Kyiv, fueled by a wave of nationalism, enacted laws banning the teaching of Hungarian in schools and removing Hungarian language signs. Worse, they have allegedly conscripted young ethnic Hungarian men and sent them to the Donbass front to die. Orbán has repeatedly warned Kyiv about these actions, but President Zelensky has ignored the warnings. The question for Budapest is self-evident. Why should Hungary supply funds and weapons to a regime that is actively oppressing its own kinsmen? The domino effect, Orbán as the pioneer. The West attempts to isolate Hungary, labeling Orbán the black sheep. However, reality is proving Orbán to be the pioneer. The anti-war wave is spreading. Neighboring Slovakia, following Robert Fico's rise to power, immediately halted military aid to Ukraine and aligned with Hungary. Fico's recent suspicious assassination attempt notwithstanding, he remains steadfast in his view that this war is not ours. In the Netherlands, Austria, and even Germany, parties like the AfD are rapidly gaining momentum. Orbán's stance of nation first and peace with Russia is becoming a mainstream trend. European citizens are exhausted. They look at Hungary, where energy is stable, borders are secure, and there are no migration riots, and they begin to ask, is Orbán right? Crucially, Orbán is not betting on Brussels. He is the only European leader who openly supported Trump from the very beginning. He believes that when Trump returns, the America First policy will align perfectly with his vision of ending the war in Ukraine. At that point, Hungary will transition from being a defiant rebel to becoming the critical bridge between Washington and Moscow. The power of the veto, the diplomacy of a small state. The obvious question is, if Hungary's opposition is so potent, why don't NATO and the EU simply expel them? The answer is simple. They cannot. Legal impotence. Legally, there is no mechanism to expel a member from either NATO or the EU merely for holding a divergent viewpoint. Geopolitical necessity. Hungary is centrally located in Europe, the continent's heart. Expelling Hungary would create an enormous logistical and defensive gap in NATO's system. Consensus is king. Most critically, NATO requires consensus. Every major decision requires a 100% vote. Hungary holds the ultimate power, the veto. Orbán understands his leverage. He uses the veto not for sabotage, but for negotiation. He vetoed the 50 billion euros aid package for Ukraine, resulting in the EU releasing 10 billion euros of Hungary's frozen funds. He delayed Sweden's NATO accession, requiring Sweden to sign a contract to sell Gripen fighter jets to Hungary. This is the diplomacy of the small state, transforming a position of obstruction into strategic leverage to maximize national interest. In the final analysis, Hungary is not a traitor. They are the West's most scathing critic. Viktor Orbán and the Hungarian people have recognized a truth that many other nations deliberately ignore: that the Ukraine war is a trap, that turning Russia into a perpetual enemy is a collective folly for Europe, and that the interests of Washington do not always coincide with the interests of Budapest or Berlin. The proposal to turn Ukraine into a buffer zone may be repellent to war advocates, but it may be the only solution left to salvage peace. Hungary is functioning as the safety valve, reducing pressure in a European pressure cooker on the verge of explosion. History may judge Orbán harshly, but at this moment, he's the only one who dares to stand in the floodwaters, raise his hand and declare, "Stop. This is madness." What is your perspective on Hungary's stance? Are they the black sheep or the savior of Europe? Share your comments below.